Hello and welcome. Today, we're exploring one of the most significant and complex chapters in world history, the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. From modest beginnings on the steppes of Central Asia to the formation of a vast empire that connected East and West, this is a journey through ambition, adaptation, and extraordinary change. Before you get comfy and drift off to the sounds of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1: The Steppes and the Seeds of Empire. Long before the sound of galloping hooves echoed across Asia, before cities trembled at the approach of a Mongol army, the story of an empire began with silence. It began in the heart of the Central Asian steppe, an ocean of grass, rolling endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seems to swallow the horizon. This was a land of beauty and brutality. In the spring, wildflowers painted the meadows with color, and herds of horses, sheep, and goats moved freely across open pastures. In winter, the wind howled across frozen ground, and snow blanketed the hills in a soft but deadly hush. The steppe gave life, but it also took it away without hesitation. To survive here required patience, resilience, and a deep understanding of nature's rhythm. For centuries, the steppe was home to nomadic peoples. They did not build great stone cities, nor did they till the soil like their agricultural neighbors to the south. Instead, they lived in portable felt tents called gers, moved with the seasons, and measured wealth in livestock. They followed herds, drew fresh water from rivers and wells, and found shelter beneath the open sky. Life on the steppe was not without conflict. Tribes and clans often clashed over grazing land, animals, and honor. Loyalty was owed first to one's immediate family, then to the broader clan. Alliances were made and broken, often sealed by marriage or war. There were no borders in the traditional sense, only territories remembered by the elders and passed down in stories. The Mongols were one among many such groups, not yet an empire, not yet a single people. They were a collection of clans, the Borjigin, the Taichi Ud, the Merkit, the Naiman, the Tatars, and others. Their languages were similar, their customs familiar, but they were not united. They lived in small, loosely affiliated bands, ruled by chieftains, each vying for power, safety, or revenge. Trade and conflict alike brought the Mongols into contact with settled civilizations to the south and west. The Chinese dynasties, like the Jin and Western Xia, considered the steppe peoples to be both a threat and a necessity. They engaged in diplomacy, hired nomadic warriors as mercenaries, and built long walls to keep them at bay. In turn, the nomads valued Chinese goods, silk, iron tools, and fine grain. Though culturally distinct, their worlds were never truly separate. Religion, too, flowed across the grasslands. The Mongols practiced a form of animism centered around a deep reverence for nature and the eternal sky. Tengri, the sky god, watched over all things. Shamans served as spiritual guides, interpreting omens, conducting rituals, and mediating between the human and the divine. But other influences, including Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, also made their way into the steppe. through trade and wandering monks. It was into this world, unsettled, open, and full of possibility, that a child named Temujin would be born. His story was not inevitable. At the time of his birth, there were no maps predicting Mongol supremacy, no prophecies foretelling world conquest. He was simply a boy, born into a fragmented land, destined for a life shaped by hardship, chance, and choice. And yet, the steppe had prepared him. It had prepared all its children, not for comfort, but for endurance. Not for safety, but for movement, for flexibility, for strength. In this land of grass and wind, where every horizon invited exploration, the seeds of empire were already scattered, waiting for someone to gather them. Chapter 2: Temujin's Rise. On the wide and whispering plains of the Mongolian steppe, around the year 1162, a child was born into the Borjigin clan. His name was Temujin. There was little to indicate that this boy would change the world. His birth was not marked by prophecy or celebrated with great fanfare. Instead, it took place in a modest camp among a humble family on land that belonged to no one and everyone at once. The Mongols were not ruled by kings or emperors. They lived by the rhythms of the steppe, led by chieftains who commanded loyalty, not law. Temujin's father, Yesugei, was a respected leader, a man of influence, with ties to other powerful clans. Through a combination of military alliances and strategic marriages, Yesugei had carved out a place for his family in the ever-shifting web of steppe politics. His position was stable, but stability in this world was always fragile. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, had a different story. She had once been abducted from another tribe by Yesugei during a raid, a common practice in steppe warfare. Yet over time she emerged as a central figure in the life of her children. Intelligent, determined, and fiercely resilient, Hoelun would become one of the most important influences on Temujin's early development. When Temujin was around 9 years old, he traveled with his father to another camp. The purpose was marriage. Yesugei had arranged for Temujin to be betrothed to a girl named Berta from the Ongirat tribe. This was a customary step in forging alliances, one that would have long-reaching consequences. Temujin stayed with the Ongirat while his father journeyed home. But on the return, Yesugei was poisoned, likely by members of the Tatar tribe, with whom he had a long-standing feud. With Yesugei's death, Temujin's life changed overnight. His family was abandoned by their own people, who no longer saw value in supporting a widow and her children. Stripped of protection and status, Hoelun and her children were forced to fend for themselves. They lived in hardship, foraging for roots, fishing in frozen rivers, and hunting small game with traps and slings. There were times when hunger pressed so closely against them that they survived only on scraps and bones. This period of exile was both cruel and formative. It taught Temujin that survival depended not only on strength, but on loyalty, discipline, and unity. He watched his mother command her children with steady authority. She refused to succumb to despair. In a world where weakness could mean death, she showed them how to persevere. Yet even within the family, tensions existed. Temujin clashed with his half-brother Begta, who sought to assert dominance as the eldest. One day, in a confrontation that turned violent, Temujin and his younger brother killed Begta. It was a moment of rupture, one that would weigh heavily in the years to come. But it also cemented Temujin's leadership within his immediate circle. As he grew older, Temujin began to reconnect with allies of his father and make new ones of his own. He sought support from the powerful Taichi-ud and from Togrul, the Khan of the Karayt tribe, a former blood brother of Yesugi. These early alliances gave Temujin the backing he needed to challenge rival factions and defend his growing following. But support was always conditional. Steppe politics were governed by personal loyalty, and loyalties could shift like sand. Temujin was betrayed more than once. He was captured by the Taichi-ud and held in a wooden collar. But he escaped, thanks to the kindness of a jailer's son, and fled back to the wilderness. Undeterred, he returned again and again to the complicated world of tribal politics. His charisma, courage, and generosity began to attract new followers. Men from lower clans who saw in Temujin a leader who valued merit more than blood. This was unusual. On the steppe, leadership was typically passed through noble lineages, but Temujin broke that mold. He rewarded loyalty above all. He shared spoils equally. He punished betrayal swiftly, and he began to develop a code, a sense of order that transcended clan rivalries. Slowly, he built not just a force, but a vision. Berta, his wife since adolescence, remained a steadfast partner. When she was kidnapped by the Merkit, a rival tribe, Temujin rallied his allies and rescued her. Her return was not only personal, but symbolic. She represented a life regained and a cause that others could rally behind. With every battle, every raid, and every victory, Temujin's reputation grew. He began to gather disparate tribes under his banner, not through brute force alone, but by offering a new kind of leadership. He abolished the traditional aristocracy, promoting commanders based on talent and loyalty. He reorganized his army into units of 10, a revolutionary move that broke old clan divisions and fostered unity. This meritocratic structure made his forces more agile, more committed, and more effective than any other on the steppe. He created laws, oral at first, that governed behavior in battle and in daily life. Theft, betrayal, and cowardice were punished severely, but those who followed the rules were protected and respected. Temujin had not yet claimed the title of Genghis Khan, but he was no longer merely a chieftain. He had become something more, a unifier, a strategist, and a symbol of change. By the dawn of the 13th century, the foundations of empire had been laid, not in gold or marble, but in trust, fear, and a vision that stretched beyond the next horizon. Chapter 3: The Birth of Genghis Khan. By the year 1206, the steppes of Mongolia had witnessed something extraordinary. Where once there had been dozens of warring tribes, each bound by ancient rivalries, fragile alliances, and shifting loyalties, now there was unity. A great assembly, called a Kurultai, was held on the banks of the Onon River. Tribal leaders, generals, and elders gathered beneath the open sky, not for battle, but for something rare and momentous: agreement. They had come to recognize one man as their leader, the man who had risen from hardship, betrayal, and exile, the man who had defeated rival clans not only with strength, but with vision. His name was Temujin. That day, the council conferred upon him a new title, Genghis Khan, often interpreted as universal ruler. It was not simply a name, it was a declaration, a symbol that a new political and social order had been born. The fractured tribes of the Mongol steppe were now one people, bound not by bloodlines, but by loyalty and shared destiny. This moment did not appear from nowhere. It was the culmination of years of careful reform, negotiation, and ruthless action. Temujin had transformed the nature of leadership. He replaced traditional clan structures with a decimal-based system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men, each led by officers chosen for their skill, not their birth. In this way, old loyalties were broken down, and new ones were forged through action and merit. Even his most trusted commanders came from humble origins, men who had proven themselves in battle, who had remained loyal in times of hardship. This approach earned him widespread support among the lower classes, who saw in Genghis Khan not a distant monarch, but a leader who understood suffering and rewarded strength. He also codified laws known as the yasa, an evolving set of rules that emphasize discipline, obedience, and justice. These laws covered everything from theft and adultery to military conduct and religious tolerance. Though the yasa was never written down in full, its principles were known and enforced. They created a sense of order that stretched across tribal and cultural lines. But even as he built a more cohesive society, Genghis Khan was preparing for expansion. The unity of the Mongol tribes was not an end, it was a beginning. With the resources, manpower, and loyalty of his people secured, Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. His ambitions extended far beyond the steppe. To the south lay the Western Xia dynasty, a powerful and well-fortified state that had long engaged with the nomadic peoples of the north. Though some Mongol tribes had served as mercenaries for the Xia, Genghis Khan sought more than service. He sought submission. And when the Xia refused to recognize Mongol supremacy, war followed. In 1209, the Mongol armies launched their first major campaign outside the traditional steppe territories. The invasion of Western Xia marked a new chapter, not just in military conquest, but in the evolution of Mongol warfare. Genghis Khan's forces were fast, flexible, and fearsome. They relied on the horse, the central symbol of Mongol life, not only for transport, but for battle. Each warrior maintained multiple mounts, allowing them to cover vast distances without fatigue. Their composite bows, powerful and compact, allowed for deadly accuracy even at high speeds. They struck quickly, encircled cities, and cut off supply lines with precision. But they were not merely horsemen. The Mongols learned from every enemy. They captured siege engineers, studied fortification layouts, and soon developed sophisticated techniques for breaching city walls. Tunnels, battering rams, catapults. These tools became part of their arsenal, especially as they moved deeper into the world of cities and stone. The campaign against Western Xia took years, but it ended with Mongol victory. The Xia were forced to acknowledge Mongol dominance and pay tribute. It was a pattern that would repeat many times over. Swift and decisive warfare, followed by negotiation, tribute, or destruction. Victory over the Xia emboldened Genghis Khan. He had tested his people in foreign lands and found them capable. More importantly, he had confirmed what he had long believed, that the strength of the Mongol people was not limited by the boundaries of the steppe. Meanwhile, the newly unified Mongol Empire continued to mature. Trade routes were protected, diplomats were sent to distant courts, information was gathered and plans were laid. Genghis Khan did not act impulsively. Each campaign was measured, each alliance carefully weighed, and as the empire grew, so did its administrative needs. Genghis Khan appointed officials to oversee taxation, logistics, and foreign affairs. He encouraged the learning of foreign languages and scripts. He welcomed clerics and scholars from many faiths, Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans, all of whom found space in his growing domain. He was, by all measures, a man of contradiction, a conqueror who prized unity, a warrior who valued law, a step-born leader who now oversaw cities and states. But his vision remained clear: a world ordered by merit, bound by loyalty, and governed by strength. The birth of Genghis Khan was not a moment, it was a movement, and the world was only beginning to feel its tremors. Chapter 4: The Conquest of North China. With the Western Shia humbled and their tribute secured, Genghis Khan turned his attention eastward, toward a far more formidable challenge, the Jin dynasty. The Jin had ruled northern China for over a century. Their armies were large, their cities fortified with stone and steel, and their economy fueled by agriculture, trade, and bureaucracy. Their capital, Zhongdu, present-day Beijing, was a center of commerce and power, surrounded by high walls and well-defended gates. But despite their strength, the Jin were vulnerable. Internally, their court was divided by factions. Externally, they had alienated many of the steppe tribes who now stood united under Genghis Khan. The Jin had once employed some of these tribes as allies or mercenaries, tools for controlling the frontier. But the rise of the Mongol Empire changed that dynamic. The steppe was no longer a buffer. It had become a launching ground. In 1211, Genghis Khan began his campaign. He led an army of roughly 90,000 men across the Gobi Desert and into the territories of the Jin. These were not random raids. They were part of a coordinated strategy, one that combined reconnaissance, terror, diplomacy, and military precision. The Mongols understood mobility better than any force of their time. They split into multiple divisions, advancing across wide fronts, enveloping enemy outposts, and drawing out defenders. They avoided direct confrontations with large garrisons unless they had the advantage. Instead, they disrupted supply chains, isolated fortresses, and turned minor victories into major psychological blows. Cities that resisted were often besieged, their defenders worn down by fear and famine. Those that surrendered swiftly were sometimes spared. The Mongol message was clear: resistance brought devastation, submission brought survival. In many ways, this campaign marked a new phase in Mongol warfare. The open steppe had given way to cities and walls, obstacles unfamiliar to a traditionally nomadic army. But the Mongols were quick to adapt. They captured Chinese engineers and siege specialists. They learned to build catapults and battering rams, to use flaming arrows and construct siege towers. They dug trenches, diverted water sources, and even employed early forms of gunpowder weaponry. The Mongol army became a hybrid force: horse archers on the plains, sappers, and siege crews at the walls. And they brought with them not just force, but information. Genghis Khan placed enormous value on intelligence. He developed networks of spies and scouts who reported on enemy movements, terrain, and supply routes. This knowledge allowed him to strike not where the enemy was strongest, but where they were least prepared. In 1213, the Mongols advanced deeper into Jin territory. They crossed the Great Wall, not as raiders, but as conquerors. Fortresses fell, towns surrendered, and all the while, the Mongol forces remained disciplined, coordinated, and relentless. The following year, Genghis Khan's generals launched a wide encirclement of Zhongdu. The Jin capital stood strong behind its high walls, but the Mongols did not rush in. They waited. They cut off trade. They intercepted food convoys. They let fear do its slow, silent work. Eventually, the city fell, not only to force, but to exhaustion. Zhongdu was captured in 1215, and with it, the Jin lost their center of power. Though remnants of the dynasty survived further south for a time, they were weakened beyond recovery. The Mongols had done what few thought possible. They had humbled one of the most powerful states in East Asia. But Genghis Khan did not linger in conquest. After securing Jin territory, he returned to Mongolia. He believed in leading by example, but he also trusted his generals to continue the campaigns while he oversaw the larger shape of the empire. The conquest of North China brought the Mongols more than land. It brought wealth, silk, grain, silver, and craftsmen. It brought knowledge, scribes, map makers, astronomers, and it brought connections, access to wider trade networks, diplomatic ties, and new cultural influences. Yet it also brought challenges. How would a nomadic empire govern cities? How could a mobile army oversee walls and bureaucrats? These were questions that would continue to shape Mongol strategy in the years ahead. Still, one thing was clear. Genghis Khan's empire was no longer confined to the steppe. It was now a continental force, and the conquest of North China had shown the world that the Mongols were not just raiders, they were rulers. Chapter 5. The Khwarezmian Campaign. After the fall of Zhongdu and the consolidation of Mongol power in northern China, Genghis Khan turned his gaze westward. He had proven that the Mongol armies could overcome cities and dynasties. But now, a new and very different challenge awaited, one that would test not only military might, but also diplomacy, patience, and retribution. The Khwarezmian Empire, centered in present-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Afghanistan, was a vast and wealthy state. It sat at the crossroads of Asia, controlling key portions of the Silk Road and boasting bustling cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, and Urgench. Ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, the empire was a hub of Islamic scholarship, architecture, and commerce. At first, Genghis Khan approached the Khwarezmians not as a conqueror, but as a partner. In 1218, he sent a large caravan of merchants eastward, laden with precious goods and trade offerings. The message was clear. The Mongol Empire, now a force to be reckoned with, sought diplomatic and commercial relations. Genghis Khan even sent envoys with letters offering friendship and open trade. But trust is fragile, and in this case, it would be shattered. When the caravan arrived at the city of Otrar, a border town in the Khwarezmian Empire, the local governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of espionage. Despite lacking evidence, he had them arrested. Their goods were seized. And then, in an act that would echo through history, the entire delegation was executed. Genghis Khan, when informed of the betrayal, did not act rashly. He sent a second mission, this time a formal diplomatic embassy, requesting an explanation and the punishment of the governor responsible. But the Shah of Khwarezm, perhaps overestimating his own power or underestimating his new rival, rejected the overture. One of the Mongol envoys was executed. The others were humiliated, shaved, and sent back east. This was not just an insult. In Mongol culture, the murder of ambassadors was one of the gravest offenses imaginable. Diplomats were considered sacred emissaries, untouchable even between enemies. What followed was not simply a campaign of war, it was a campaign of vengeance. In 1219, Genghis Khan mobilized a massive army, estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 men. This force was one of the most disciplined and versatile military machines the world had ever seen. But this campaign would be different from any before. It would not be a single strike. It would be a total dismantling of an empire. The Mongols divided into multiple columns, advancing along separate paths with coordinated precision. They crossed the treacherous terrain of the Tian Shan Mountains and the arid stretches of the Central Asian deserts. The Shah, caught off guard by their rapid movement, failed to organize a unified defense. City by city, the Mongols struck with overwhelming force. First came Otrar, the city where the caravan had been massacred. It was placed under siege for months. The resistance was stubborn, but eventually the gates were breached. Ain al-Chuk, the governor who had ordered the execution of the merchants, was captured. According to chroniclers, he was executed in a particularly brutal fashion, reportedly having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. Whether apocryphal or not, the message was clear. Justice, Mongol style, was absolute. Next came Bukhara, a jewel of the Islamic world. Genghis Khan reportedly entered the city on horseback, walked through its mosques, and addressed the citizens directly. "I am the punishment of God," he is said to have proclaimed. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The city was sacked, its defenders killed, though its artisans and educated classes were often spared and deported eastward to serve the empire. Then came Samarkand, the Shah's crown jewel. He had gathered a sizable force to defend it, including war elephants and heavy infantry. But the Mongols, as always, adapted. They avoided direct assault when needed, drew defenders out through feigned retreats, and sowed chaos within enemy ranks. Samarkand fell within days. The city's citadel held out a bit longer, but was ultimately overwhelmed. The Shah, fleeing from city to city, realized too late the scale of what he had provoked. With each defeat, his support waned. He fled south across the desert, pursued relentlessly by Mongol detachments, but always just beyond their reach. Eventually, he crossed into an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died in exile, disgraced and broken. But the Mongols were not finished. They pursued his son, Jalal ad-Din, who attempted to rally forces in Persia and Afghanistan. At times, Jalal ad-Din managed to win small battles, showing bravery and resilience. But he too was eventually defeated, and his attempts at restoring Khwarezmian authority collapsed. In their wake, the Mongols left behind devastation, but also transformation. Cities were burned, yes, but irrigation systems were rebuilt. Captured engineers were sent to Mongolia. Scholars and artisans were relocated to distant corners of the empire. The Mongols believed in utility. What was valuable was preserved and repurposed. What resisted was destroyed. The Khwarezmian campaign had a profound effect on Genghis Khan himself. It confirmed the reach of his power. It tested the mobility and endurance of his armies, and it introduced him to new cultures, technologies, and administrative techniques. From this point on, the Mongol Empire was not simply expanding, it was absorbing, reshaping, and reorganizing the very fabric of Eurasia. As for the people who lived through the invasion, their stories were complex. Some saw the Mongols as terrifying conquerors, bringers of death and ruin. Others, especially in later years, viewed them as agents of stability, harsh but fair rulers who punished corruption and protected trade. The reality, as always, lay somewhere in between. What is certain is that the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire marked a turning point, not just in the life of Genghis Khan, but in the history of the world. The Mongol Empire had now reached from the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea, and it was far from finished. Chapter 6: The Legacy of Genghis Khan. By the early 1220s, the name Genghis Khan had become known from the shores of the Pacific to the deserts of Central Asia. His campaigns had devastated powerful empires, disrupted ancient trade routes, and reshaped the political map of the known world. But Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror. He was also a ruler. And even as his armies rode across Asia, he remained focused on building something that could endure, something that would outlast even his own formidable life. Though born into a nomadic society, Genghis Khan had an extraordinary sense of order and administration. As his empire expanded, so too did his understanding of governance. The Mongol Empire was not built on brute strength alone. It was held together by systems, legal, logistical, and ideological, that Genghis himself helped to design and implement. At the heart of Mongol administration was the yasa, a set of laws that guided both military and civil conduct. The exact contents of the yasa were never formally recorded in a single document, but its principles were widely known and strictly enforced. It emphasized discipline, loyalty, and merit. Theft, desertion, and betrayal were met with severe punishment, but so too were acts of corruption and abuse of power. Genghis Khan demanded that his commanders obey orders to the letter. In return, he rewarded them generously, not just with plunder, but with status, responsibility, and respect. He created a chain of command based not on noble lineage, but on ability. Promotions were earned, not inherited. And within this meritocracy, even men of humble origin could rise to positions of great authority. To maintain communication across the vast expanse of his territory, Genghis Khan developed a courier system known as the Yam. It was a series of relay stations, each staffed with fresh horses and messengers, that allowed information to travel quickly between distant outposts. This was more than a military tool. It was a connective tissue for the empire, facilitating governance, trade, and diplomacy. The Mongol Empire also became a crossroads of cultures. Genghis Khan valued knowledge and expertise, regardless of origin. He welcomed Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, Islamic astronomers, and European artisans into his court. Skilled captives were not enslaved, they were employed. Their talents were seen as valuable assets in the building of the empire. Religious tolerance was another cornerstone of Genghis Khan's rule. Though a devout believer in the sky god Tengri, he did not impose his faith on others. Instead, he encouraged religious freedom, understanding that unity could not be sustained through spiritual uniformity. Buddhist lamas, Muslim imams, Nestorian Christian priests, and Confucian scholars were all allowed to practice and preach under Mongol protection. In some cases, they were even exempt from taxation. Economically, Genghis Khan took deliberate steps to protect and encourage trade. He lowered tolls and tariffs, issued passports to traveling merchants, and ensured the safety of caravans along the Silk Road. His rule ushered in a period of stability and connectivity across Eurasia. a time that would later be known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. This peace was not without its costs. Many of the cities that benefited from it had previously been sacked or subdued. The Mongol method was often brutal in the moment, but orderly in the aftermath. Territories that submitted quickly were incorporated smoothly. Those that resisted were made examples of. This duality, destruction followed by administration, defined the Mongol approach to empire building. As his empire solidified, Genghis Khan also began thinking about the future. He knew that the unity of the Mongol people could not depend solely on his own presence. Succession had to be planned, disputes prevented. At various Kurultais, or tribal councils, he involved his sons in governance, preparing them to rule different regions of the empire. He had 4 principal sons: Jochi, Chagatai, Urgedei, and Tolui. Each had their strengths and followers, but tension also existed, particularly between Jochi, whose legitimacy had long been questioned, and his brothers. Genghis Khan, in his wisdom, sought to preserve balance. He ultimately chose Urgedei, his 3rd son, as his successor, a decision that would be ratified by the elders after his death. In the meantime, the campaigns continued. In 1226, Genghis Khan launched a second expedition against the Western Shia, who had defied his authority by refusing to send troops in the Khwarezmian campaign. This time, the Mongol army laid waste to their cities methodically. The campaign was exhaustive and unrelenting. As always, Genghis Khan led from the front, even in his 60s. But it was during this campaign that his health began to fail. The exact cause of his death remains a mystery. Some sources say he fell from his horse. Others suggest he died from injuries sustained in battle, illness, or possibly assassination. Regardless of the circumstances, Genghis Khan died in 1227. His death kept secret for weeks, so that the army could complete the final stages of the Xia conquest. His body was returned to Mongolia, likely buried near the sacred Burkhan Khaldun mountain, a place he held dear. According to legend, his funeral procession killed anyone it encountered to preserve the secrecy of the burial site. The exact location remains unknown to this day. Before his death, Genghis Khan had decreed that his empire would be divided among his 4 sons, with Urgedei serving as the Great Khan, supreme among equals. Each son would govern a portion of the empire, but all would remain loyal to the central authority of the Khagan. It was a vision of distributed power, an empire held together by family ties, shared culture, and mutual respect. And yet, even in death, Genghis Khan's legacy continued to grow. His descendants would go on to rule vast territories, from China to Eastern Europe. They would establish new dynasties, forge new alliances, and carry Mongol influence into every corner of Eurasia. But they would also face new challenges of fragmentation, cultural integration, and ambition. The world Genghis Khan left behind was not peaceful, but it was connected in ways never seen before. Under his leadership, a scattered people had become a global force. His reforms had turned tribal warriors into disciplined soldiers. His laws had given order to chaos, and his vision had redefined what empire could mean. He was not a man of myths. He was a man of movement, of decision, and of change. And his legacy would continue to echo across mountains, rivers, deserts, and cities for centuries to come. Chapter 7: Expansion into Europe and the Middle East. When Genghis Khan passed away in 1227, he left behind more than a sprawling empire. He left behind a template for power. His military, administrative, and diplomatic systems had proven remarkably effective, and now it was the task of his successors to maintain and expand what he had built. At the helm of this legacy was his third son, Ögedei Khan, the chosen Great Khan. Ögedei, though less celebrated than his father, was a capable and pragmatic ruler. He respected the traditions of the steppe, but also understood the demands of a growing empire. From his capital at Karakorum, a newly founded city in the heart of Mongolia, he oversaw the continued expansion of Mongol rule in all directions. The Mongol conquests did not pause with the founder's death. In fact, they accelerated. To the west, the stage was set for a series of campaigns that would bring the Mongols into direct contact with the Islamic heartlands, the Christian kingdoms of Europe, and the fractured territories of the former Kievan Rus. One of the key figures in this phase was Subutai, Genghis Khan's most brilliant general. Trained from youth in the arts of warfare and strategy, Subutai had accompanied Genghis on numerous campaigns. Under Ögedei's reign, he would become the architect of some of the Mongol Empire's most audacious military operations. The first major Western campaign began in 1236, targeting the Volga Bulgars, the Cumans, and the fragmented principalities of Russia. Subutai led a coalition of Mongol forces, including those under Batu Khan, the son of Jochi and grandson of Genghis Khan. The Mongols crossed the Volga River and swept across the steppe, overwhelming their enemies with speed, discipline, and deception. The Mongol method remained consistent: swift cavalry charges, coordinated assaults, feigned retreats, and precision in communication. Russian cities, one after another, fell. Ryazan, Suzdal, Kozelsk, and eventually Kiev, once the center of Kievan Rus, were sacked with ruthless efficiency. Kiev's great churches, its libraries, and its defenses were no match for Mongol siegecraft. Survivors spoke of fire raining from the sky and walls crumbling beneath battering rams. The destruction of Kiev in 1240 marked the collapse of centralized Russian resistance. The Mongols had not only conquered, they had restructured the region's political geography. Local princes were now required to pay tribute to Batu Khan, who would go on to found the Golden Horde, a semi-autonomous khanate that ruled over vast territories in Russia and Eastern Europe. But the Mongols did not stop there. In 1241, they launched a massive invasion into Eastern Europe. Their armies, organized into multiple wings, simultaneously advanced into Poland, Hungary, and Transylvania. At Legnica, a combined force of Poles, Germans, and Knights Templar attempted to halt the Mongol advance. They were decisively defeated. Just days later, another Mongol force under Subutai crushed the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi. The victory was total, and Hungary was left defenseless. Panic spread across Europe. News of the Mongol advance traveled faster than the armies themselves. Cities fortified their walls. Kings and popes sent frantic messages to one another. For many, it seemed as though the end of Christendom had arrived. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the Mongols withdrew. The reason for their retreat was not military resistance. It was news from the east. Ögedei Khan had died, and all princes of Genghis Khan's lineage were required to return for the Kurultai, the assembly to select the next great Khan. This unexpected development spared Europe from what may have been further devastation. It also highlighted one of the unique features of Mongol governance, the balance between conquest and continuity. Even in the midst of expansion, the Mongols maintained their customs, their hierarchies, and their systems of succession. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, another front of expansion was unfolding. Even before the European campaigns, Mongol forces had begun to press into the Persian plateau, the Caucasus, and beyond. After the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan had left a power vacuum in the region. His successors moved quickly to establish dominance, targeting cities like Tabriz, Rai, and Isfahan. By the 1250s, a new Mongol Khanate was forming, the Ilkhanate, under the rule of Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis. Hulagu's mission was ambitious. He sought to conquer the entire Islamic world. His first major target was the Assassins, a secretive sect based in the mountains of Persia. After a prolonged siege, their stronghold at Alamut was captured and dismantled, ending centuries of clandestine influence. But his most infamous conquest came in 1258 with the siege of Baghdad. At the time, Baghdad was the intellectual and cultural center of the Islamic world. It was home to scholars, poets, mathematicians, and libraries that held centuries of knowledge. The Abbasid Caliphate, though weakened, remained a symbol of unity for Muslims across the region. Hulagu demanded the caliph's surrender. When it was refused, the Mongols laid siege. Their artillery shattered the city's defenses, and Mongol troops poured in. What followed was one of the most devastating sacks in world history. The House of Wisdom, a famed repository of learning, was destroyed. The Tigris River, it is said, ran black with ink and red with blood. Baghdad's fall shocked the world. It marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and symbolized a seismic shift in Middle Eastern history. Yet, even amid destruction, the Mongols again absorbed and adapted. In the years that followed, the Ilkhanate would integrate Persian administrative techniques and convert, over time, to Islam. Hulagu's descendants became patrons of Islamic architecture, science, and the arts. Across these varied campaigns, from Russia to Hungary, from Persia to Mesopotamia, the Mongols had demonstrated unmatched versatility. They were not confined by terrain or culture. They learned from their enemies. They employed foreign engineers and scholars. They respected practical knowledge more than tradition. And wherever they went, they left a permanent mark, sometimes as conquerors, sometimes as governors. The expansion into Europe and the Middle East was not the end of Mongol ambition, but it marked the outer edges of their reach. What followed in later years was not further conquest, but adaptation. Different khanates, different cultures, different destinies. Still, the unity that had begun under Genghis Khan endured in spirit, and his descendants, spread across continents, continued to carry the banner of the empire he had built. Chapter 8: The Age of Kublai Khan. Among the many descendants of Genghis Khan, few would wield power as extensively or as uniquely as Kublai Khan, the grandson who would transform the Mongol Empire into a global phenomenon. His reign signaled not only continued expansion, but also a profound shift in the empire's identity. Under Kublai, the Mongols would rule not as outsiders, but as emperors of one of the world's most ancient civilizations, China. Born in 1215, Kublai was the son of Tolui, the youngest of Genghis Khan's 4 sons, and a powerful Mongol princess named Sorghaghtani Beki. His mother, a devout Nestorian Christian, was deeply educated and politically astute. She ensured that Kublai and his brothers received a broad education, not only in Mongol traditions and warfare, but in the literature, philosophy, and history of the diverse peoples they ruled. Kublai grew up during a time of transition. His grandfather had built the empire through conquest. His father had managed its early administration. Now, a new generation had to learn how to govern vast, diverse populations. Kublai, even in youth, showed signs of diplomatic acumen. He was curious, thoughtful, and politically cautious. In the early 1250s, he was entrusted by his brother, Mongol Khan, then Great Khan, to oversee the conquest of Song China, the last major holdout in the south. This was not an easy task. The Song dynasty had resisted Mongol incursions for decades, and their defenses were sophisticated. Massive stone fortifications, skilled naval forces, and deep knowledge of the terrain. Kublai took a different approach from earlier Mongol leaders. While maintaining military pressure, he also studied Chinese administrative systems. He surrounded himself with Confucian advisors and adopted elements of Chinese court ritual. He encouraged agricultural development, tax reforms, and infrastructure repair. He began to position himself not just as a Mongol Khan, but as a legitimate Chinese ruler. This dual identity, Mongol by birth, Chinese by governance, would define Kublai's reign. In 1260, following Mongol's death, Kublai declared himself Great Khan. But the succession was contested. His brother Arik Boker, based in Karakorum, also claimed the title. What followed was a civil war within the empire. A war not of conquest, but of vision. Arik Boker represented traditional nomadic Mongolism. Kublai, a hybrid model of Mongol authority rooted in sedentary administration. The war lasted 4 years. Ultimately, Kublai triumphed, but his victory marked the beginning of a fragmentation within the empire. While he was recognized as Great Khan, the Western Khanates, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Golden Horde increasingly operated as independent states. The idea of a unified Mongol Empire persisted in name, but in practice, it had become a constellation of related but autonomous powers. Nonetheless, Kublai's own realm flourished. In 1271, he formally declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty, adopting a Chinese dynastic title and making it clear that he intended to rule as emperor, not just conqueror. The capital was established at Dadu, known today as Beijing, and it became a bustling metropolis, an imperial center that combined Mongol austerity with Chinese sophistication. After years of preparation, Kublai launched the final campaign against the southern Song. The war was long and grueling. The Mongols had to adapt again, this time to river warfare. They constructed fleets, recruited local sailors, and besieged fortified cities with a combination of brute force and negotiation. The final blow came in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen, where the Song navy was decisively defeated. The young Song emperor, just a child, was lost to the sea. With that, the last major opposition in China fell, and Kublai Khan stood as the first foreigner to rule all of China. But ruling China came with challenges. Kublai struggled to balance Mongol customs with Chinese expectations. He implemented a 4-tier social structure that placed Mongols at the top, followed by non-Han allies like Central Asians and Persians, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese. This hierarchy created resentment, particularly among scholars and bureaucrats who had long seen themselves as the custodians of Chinese civilization. Still, Kublai worked to integrate. He patronized Chinese art, poetry, and science. He commissioned maps, histories, and observatories. His court became a hub of global culture, where Persian astronomers, Arab doctors, Indian mathematicians, and European travelers mingled. It was during this time that Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant, arrived in China. He would later describe the splendor of Kublai's court in Europe, portraying the Khan as a wise and just ruler presiding over an empire of marvels. Whether or not all of his accounts were accurate, they helped shape the Western imagination of the East for generations. Kublai's ambitions, however, extended beyond China. He launched naval invasions of Japan in 1274 and again in 1281. Both attempts failed. The first was repelled by determined samurai resistance and storms. The second, much larger invasion was destroyed by a typhoon, the so-called kamikaze, or divine wind. These failures marked the limits of Mongol expansion. Kublai also attempted to assert control over Vietnam, Burma, and Java. Though some of these campaigns achieved short-term victories, none resulted in lasting Mongol rule. The tropical terrain, unfamiliar diseases, and guerrilla tactics of the local populations proved difficult to overcome. As Kublai aged, the burdens of rule weighed heavily on him. He mourned the death of his beloved wife Chabi and his favorite son. He grew more withdrawn, more indulgent, and less decisive. Corruption crept into the bureaucracy. Local rebellions began to simmer. He died in 1294 at the age of 79, having ruled for over 3 decades. Kublai Khan's legacy is profound. He completed the conquest of China and established a dynasty that, despite later instability, would last nearly a century. He expanded global trade, protected religious freedom, and presided over one of the most cosmopolitan courts in world history. He was not simply a Mongol conqueror, he was a world emperor. And yet, with his death, the cohesion of the empire continued to fray. The Yuan dynasty would eventually lose its grip on China. The Western Khanates pursued their own paths, and the dream of a single Mongol world, once so vivid, would slowly fade. But for a time, for one remarkable moment in history, under Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire stood not just as a symbol of conquest, but as a beacon of global connection. Chapter 9. The Fragmentation of the Empire. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, he left behind an empire that was, at least in theory, the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever known. From the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the forests of Eastern Europe, from the steppes of Mongolia to the deserts of Persia, it stretched across climates, languages, and faiths. But the vision of unity that Genghis Khan had once forged was now giving way to something else, something more complex and inevitable. Fragmentation. It had begun even earlier, during the reigns of Genghis Khan's immediate successors. The sheer size of the empire made direct rule from a single center unworkable, and so, as new territories were added, Genghis Khan had divided his realm among his sons, each tasked with governing a portion in allegiance to the great Khan in Mongolia. This model worked for a time, as long as the Khans acknowledged the supremacy of Karakoram or Dadu. But over generations, distance bred independence, cultural differences deepened, political ambitions diverged, and gradually, the unified Mongol Empire became a collection of related but autonomous states, what historians would later call the Four Khanates. The first was the Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by the descendants of Kublai Khan. Though they adopted Chinese court rituals and governance models, they remained Mongol in identity and elite culture. Their rule brought infrastructure development, expanded trade, and administrative reform, but also increasing tension with the native Chinese population. Over time, natural disasters, economic strain, and peasant uprisings eroded their control. The dynasty would fall in 1368 to the Ming, ending nearly a century of Mongol rule in China. The second was the Golden Horde, founded by Batu Khan, the son of Jochi. This Khanate ruled over the vast steppes and forests of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Initially centered in Sarai on the Volga River, the Golden Horde maintained loose control over Slavic principalities through a system of tribute and vassalage. For generations, Russian princes traveled to Sarai to seek approval for their rule. But as Moscow and other city-states grew in strength, Mongol influence waned. By the late 15th century, the Golden Horde had splintered, and Russia had begun its ascent. The third Khanate was the Chagatai Khanate, named after Genghis Khan's second son. It controlled Central Asia, from the Aral Sea to the borders of China. Initially nomadic in character, the Chagatai Khanate eventually split into eastern and western sections. In the west, it increasingly absorbed Islamic influence. In the east, it became a staging ground for later Mongol invasions of India and China. The Khanate endured for centuries in various forms, but it too was weakened by internal strife and external pressure. And finally, the fourth Khanate was the Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan in Persia. After the fall of Baghdad in 1258, Hulagu's descendants ruled over a region rich in culture and scholarship. They embraced Persian administrative traditions and, over time, converted to Islam. This integration helped legitimize their rule among the local population. However, after the death of Abu Sa'id, the last strong Ilkhan in 1335, the Ilkhanate fractured into smaller states. Mongol rule in Persia faded, but its legacy remained in architecture, scholarship, and religious transformation. These four Khanates, though originally part of one empire, increasingly acted as independent states. They fought wars with one another. They formed alliances, traded goods, and even exchanged emissaries. But they no longer answered to a single authority. The title of Great Khan, once central to Mongol identity, became symbolic. The fragmentation was not only political, it was also cultural. In the Yuan dynasty, Mongols learned Chinese language, Confucian values, and Buddhist cosmology. In the Ilkhanate, they adopted Persian poetry, Islamic theology, and administrative bureaucracy. In the Golden Horde, they absorbed Turkic traditions and eventually embraced Islam. In Chagatai lands, they became both patrons of Sufi mysticism and practitioners of nomadic steppe customs. Over time, the distinctiveness of Mongol identity softened, reshaped by geography, intermarriage, and cultural blending. What remained, however, was a shared memory, a lineage that could be traced back to Genghis Khan. Even in places where Mongol power receded, the prestige of descent from Genghis endured. This memory was invoked again and again. Rulers in Central Asia, including Tamerlane or Timur, claimed symbolic ties to Genghis, even though they were not direct descendants. Timur married into the Chagatai line and built an empire on the legacy of Mongol conquest. His campaigns in the late 14th century echoed the strategies of his predecessors: swift cavalry raids, devastating sieges, and tolerance paired with terror. In the Russian world, too, the memory of the Mongol yoke shaped political development. Muscovite princes learned administrative techniques from their Mongol overlords: taxation, military mobilization, and centralized control. In time, they used these lessons to build their own state, one that would eventually challenge the legacies of the Khans. The Mongol influence stretched even further. In China, maps and maritime charts from the Yuan period laid the groundwork for later exploration. In the Islamic world, scholars debated Mongol conversions and integrated Mongol rulers into Islamic historiography. In Europe, the stories of Marco Polo fueled fantasies of Eastern wealth and power, even as the trauma of earlier invasions lingered. Yet, even amid this rich legacy, the idea of a singular Mongol empire was gone. What remained were echoes, scattered across deserts, mountains, and steppes. Castles built in Persian style with Mongol blueprints, coins minted with the faces of Khans who spoke Turkic but rode like Genghis, libraries in Samarkand and Baghdad that blended Chinese, Indian, and Arab thought. Fragmentation was not failure, it was transformation. What Genghis Khan had created was not merely a territorial empire, but a network of trade, of knowledge, of movement. And even after the Khans lost their thrones, that network endured. The Silk Road, guarded by Mongol patrols, had connected continents. Ideas flowed along it: paper, printing, mathematics, medicine. So did people: pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, and scholars. The world after Genghis Khan was different from the one before: more connected, more aware, and more interwoven. The age of empire had given way to an age of exchange. Chapter 10: The enduring impact of the Mongol Empire. As the 14th century drew to a close, the last embers of unified Mongol rule flickered and faded. The great Khanates had fractured. Former territories had found new rulers, new flags, new religions. The imperial banners that once flew over distant horizons, from the forests of Poland to the coastlines of Korea, were now lowered, stored, and forgotten. And yet, the Mongol Empire had not truly vanished. Its banners might have disappeared, its palaces crumbled, and its dynasties fallen. But its impact, profound and far-reaching, continued to shape the world in ways both subtle and staggering. The story of the Mongol Empire was no longer just about its conquests, but about what it had left behind, its architecture of influence, its legacy of integration, and the profound changes it brought to human civilization. Let us wander slowly now, step by step, through the lasting influence of the Mongol world, the world reconnected. Before the Mongols, the Silk Road had existed for centuries, but never before had it been so secure, so continuous, so thoroughly protected across its entire stretch. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, was not a myth, but a practical reality. Under Mongol rule, the world became smaller. Caravans laden with silk and spices could travel from the Chinese interior all the way to the Mediterranean without encountering closed borders. Roads were watched, rest stops maintained, and passports issued under the imperial yam system. Mongol soldiers, positioned strategically across thousands of miles, ensured safe passage, not out of charity, but out of strategic foresight. A thriving trade network benefited the empire in every direction. It was during this time that Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, made his way to Kublai Khan's court. He was not the first European to travel east, but he became the most famous. and he would not be the last. Other merchants, ambassadors, priests, and adventurers followed. Their letters and stories spread across Europe, sparking wonder and laying the seeds for the later age of exploration. Europeans had long been cut off from much of Asia, both geographically and politically, but the Mongols reopened the doors. Goods flowed: porcelain, jade, tea, lacquerware, gunpowder. So too did ideas, mathematical theories from India and Persia, Chinese inventions, Islamic astronomy. In the Muslim world, Mongol rulers like the Ilkhans created an environment where scholars of all backgrounds could exchange knowledge. In cities like Tabriz, Baghdad, and Maraga, Christian monks, Jewish doctors, Zoroastrian astronomers, and Muslim philosophers shared the same courts. The Mongols did not demand religious conformity. They demanded competence and loyalty. The result was an unparalleled fusion of ideas, the spread of inventions and knowledge. Many of the technologies that reached Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries came not from direct discovery, but from Mongol transmission. The compass, the astrolabe, and most famously, gunpowder. These tools of the future were handed down, tested in Mongol campaigns, and carried westward. Gunpowder in particular changed the very nature of warfare. The Mongols had already begun using it in the form of fire lances and grenades in their sieges of Chinese cities. As this technology spread to the Middle East and then Europe, it would eventually render the castle walls of feudal lords obsolete and usher in a new age of artillery and gunpowder empires. Likewise, papermaking and printing, which had long been part of Chinese life, reached Islamic lands, and then Europe. Mongol patronage of scholars and scribes ensured that texts, both sacred and scientific, were copied and distributed. The thirst for knowledge, once isolated within monasteries or courtly libraries, began to spread outward. Even the decimal-based administrative systems pioneered by Genghis Khan left their mark. The Mongol emphasis on meritocracy, though often imperfect, challenged older feudal and tribal models. Soldiers were promoted for performance, not noble birth. Administrators were chosen for their skills, not their surnames. These principles inspired reformers in later centuries, including early modern empires like the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, who blended Mongol military structure with their own cultural legacies. Religious influence and tolerance. One of the most extraordinary features of the Mongol Empire was its policy of religious tolerance. This was not a product of modern liberalism. It was practical and born of necessity. The Mongol world was too vast, too diverse, to impose a single faith. Instead, Genghis Khan and his successors fostered an environment where different religions coexisted. Shamanism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Manichaeism, and Zoroastrianism were all practiced across the empire. In major cities, it was not uncommon to find temples, churches, mosques, and shrines within walking distance of one another. Mongol courts employed priests of many faiths, not only for ritual, but for governance. Religious leaders often served as advisors, negotiators, and teachers. Mongol rulers offered tax exemptions to monks and clergy, and sometimes asked them to pray for victory before battle. In time, however, different khanates began to adopt dominant religions. The Ilkhanate embraced Islam. The Yuan retained Buddhist traditions. The Golden Horde eventually became Muslim. But the principle of tolerance remained. No other medieval empire, save perhaps the Islamic caliphates, demonstrated such breadth of spiritual pluralism. This environment of tolerance laid a precedent. Later empires, like the Mughal Empire in India, would echo this approach. Even in parts of Europe, where religious warfare raged, scholars looked east with wonder at how such vast territories could be ruled with so little sectarian strife. Political legacy and statecraft. Though the Mongol Empire eventually dissolved into distinct khanates, each retained certain shared methods of governance inherited from Genghis Khan's reforms. The yam system, for instance, persisted in forms across Asia, later adopted and adapted by the Russians in their postal routes and by the Ottomans in their administrative relays. Mongol legal ideas, though harsh by modern standards, emphasize clarity, consistency, and accountability. The Yasa, with its secret but widely known provisions, demanded honesty among officials and swift punishment for theft, corruption, and betrayal. In regions where bribery and noble privilege had long dominated, this approach brought a strange sense of fairness. Mongol taxation was systematic, not arbitrary. Census-taking became common. Populations were counted, resources logged, and production tracked. This created the foundation for modern bureaucratic states. Even diplomacy, the sending of envoys, the use of passports, and the creation of international protocols was influenced by Mongol practices. Their messengers traveled under the protection of the empire, and harming them was considered a capital offense. This reverence for diplomacy helped lay the groundwork for international norms centuries later. Genetic and demographic impact. Another, more subtle legacy of the Mongols can be found in the human genome. Studies have suggested that a significant portion of men across Central Asia share a common Y chromosome lineage that likely originated from Genghis Khan and his immediate descendants. This is not myth. It's a reflection of how dynastic power, concubinage, and aristocratic lineage were tied to Mongol conquest and governance. As the Mongols moved through territories, they intermarried with local elites. This mingling, sometimes voluntary, sometimes not, created a web of familial ties that stretched across continents. In Persia, India, Russia, and China, noble families would proudly claim descent from the Great Khan. The demographic impact was also evident in population displacement and resettlement. The Mongols relocated artisans, engineers, and scholars from conquered regions to serve in their cities. These movements, often forced, reshaped communities and introduced new skills and traditions to foreign lands. A cautionary memory. And yet, the legacy of the Mongol Empire is not only one of progress and connection. It is also a memory of trauma, cities destroyed, populations decimated, libraries burned. For many cultures, the Mongols were remembered not as enlightened rulers, but as an unstoppable force of ruin. In Baghdad, the sacking of the city in 1258 is remembered as one of the darkest moments in Islamic history. In Eastern Europe, tales of Mongol invasions lingered in folk memory as stories of terror. In China, resentment toward the Yuan dynasty persisted for generations after its fall. These dual legacies of destruction and development, of horror and harmony, make the Mongol story one of the most complex in human history. It was not a tale of good or evil, it was a tale of power, how it is used, how it changes those who wield it, and how it leaves echoes long after the last hoofbeats have faded. And so, we come to the end of our journey, a journey that has taken us across the vast, windswept steppes of Mongolia, through the golden domes of Persia, along the ancient cities of China and into the snow-covered forests of Eastern Europe. We've traced the rise of a scattered people who, under the leadership of a determined and visionary man, came to rule the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. From humble beginnings, the Mongols changed the world, not just through the force of arms, but through the connections they forged, the systems they established, and the cultures they touched and transformed. Their legacy is not one-dimensional. It is not a simple tale of conquest or cruelty. It is a tapestry woven from many threads, threads of war and wisdom, destruction and diplomacy, suffering and innovation. We've seen how Genghis Khan, once just a boy born into hardship, grew to become one of the most formidable leaders the world has ever known. We followed his descendants as they expanded the empire, each taking pieces of his vision into new lands, some as warriors, some as emperors, some as patrons of science, art, and religion. And we've reflected on the empire's eventual fragmentation, how time, geography, and ambition pulled the great Mongol tapestry apart. Yet, even as borders shifted and khanates dissolved, the influence of the empire never fully vanished. Its impact lives on, in maps, in books, in architecture, in language, in the very idea that the world can be connected across distance and difference. Perhaps, more than anything, the story of the Mongol Empire reminds us of the complexity of history. It teaches us that greatness and violence often walk hand in hand, that empires can destroy and also build, that fear and respect, resistance and admiration can all exist within the same memory. In the quiet stillness of night, as your thoughts drift like dust across an ancient road, you may find yourself imagining the distant thunder of hooves, the flicker of a fire outside a felt tent, or the echo of a decree spoken in a dozen languages across a continent. These are not just the sounds of the past. They are echoes of a world that was real and raw and full of motion. Thank you for walking this path with me. If you've enjoyed this long, quiet journey through history, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, or sharing this video with someone who might also enjoy drifting off to the rhythm of the past. There are many more stories yet to be told, of stars and gods, philosophers and kings, forgotten cities and timeless questions. But for now, rest easy, close your eyes, and let the footsteps of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.